Hi, and welcome to another Wednesday's Word. This morning I was reading the end of the book of Nehemiah, and the chapter heading was Nehemiah's Final Reforms. Nehemiah had gone off. At the very beginning of the book, the king gives him permission to go and asks him how long he'll be there, so he has to go back and check in. And so he's with King Artaxerxes of Babylon, and when he finally gets back, he finds that Israel has fallen off the rails. Between him and Ezra, they had put together the reforms of reestablishing the priests, rebuilding the temple, rebuilding the wall, and dedicating it. Israel was not back to the glory days and golden years of Solomon, but it was on the right track. When he comes back, things had gone awry. Tobiah, the Hornite, one of the people who opposed the walls and was threatening Israel with death and warfare, was living in the temple courts. The Levites weren't getting their tithes anymore, so they had gone home and they were manning their own fields. People were intermarrying with the worlds around them, the unreligions, and it's not about intermarrying, it's about taking on their gods. And so it's not a racial thing where you can't marry someone of this color or this ethnicity, but it's about worship. If people became worshipers of Yahweh, they were allowed to be married, but their little kids weren't even speaking the language of the land. They didn't know who God was. And he compares them to King Solomon, who married all these foreign wives, and it led his heart away to worship foreign gods. So in other words, Nehemiah left, and when he came back, Israel was on the path to another exile and another destruction, which is what does happen in history. And it's a frustrating thing for Nehemiah. It's also a frustrating thing for the church, because if you follow church history, that's been the whole thing. I'm a part of the Christian Reformed Church in America. So we've got the word reformed right in the title. When people ask me what reformed means, the short version is not Catholic. The longer version is that the church in general had been corrupted, following traditions, seeking power and money, as all human institutions do. The Bible stood against much of what the church was doing, the selling of indulgences, the crusades. Those things you're not going to find in the Bible. Those were things that people did out of misguided motives. And so when we compared the church to the Bible, we saw things needed to change. And so we tried to reform the church, or not we, Martin Luther, John Calvin, and others tried to reform the church based on the Bible. The Catholic Church wouldn't have it, and so other denominations broke off. So the denomination, the Reformed Church, was the Dutch version of this non-Catholic group, Protestants. We protested how they were doing things, and we broke off. There was a big Reformed Church moved to America, and then they became the Reformed Church in America. 100 years ago or so, even that needed to be reformed. The Christian Reformed broke off of the Reformed Church because the Reformed Church would not reform themselves according to the Word of God on a few important issues. And so these things continue. We're always reforming. In fact, there's an old line, Semper Reformata, which means that we are always reforming. Today, the church needs to be reformed. In a generation, the church will need to be reformed. The goal is to constantly reform the church, but not just to reform it by the Word of God. When I left seminary, I began to interact with the Reformed Church at large, and I was a part of that older Reformed Church in America. And people would say, yeah, the church is reformed and always reforming. That means we have to take these current cultural expressions of sexuality or gender roles or whatever it is and reform the church based on what culture is telling us is okay. And that's not at all what's going on in the Bible. It's not at all what we're called to do. That's not what our church polity, our church government tells us to do. We don't put our finger up and say, okay, what does the culture say is okay right now? And then reform the church according to that. People have done that throughout history. As recently as World War II, there was the Confessing Church in Germany against the state church because the state church was reforming themselves based on what the Germans wanted. And unfortunately, there's churches in America that are reforming themselves based on what the culture wants. There are some that are very far left that proclaim that abortion, homosexuality, and other things are completely accurate. I've seen just a few weeks ago a drag queen going down the aisle of a church to standing ovations and applause. There are other churches that are so far right that they're no longer according to the Word of God, where it's more about guns and human rights and social rights on the way the right defines them than about the Bible. And so on both sides, we say, no, let's reform this according to the Word of God. And so that's the goal. The goal is not to step in line with Hollywood. The goal is not to step in line with the Democrats or Republicans or even with church trends. a very insidious thing that happens, is you grab a church leader that you really like. I really respect people like Tim Keller, John Piper. And if I try to reform myself by them, slowly but surely, things go off pace. If I try to make myself more Tim Keller, if I try to make myself more R.C. Sproul, the next thing you know, I'll be taking on some of their bad tendencies and amplifying them. And then the next generation will take those bad tendencies and amplify them. And we've again completely lost the Word of God over time. So the goal isn't to find who we want to follow, it's to find the God we want to follow. And the God of the Bible has revealed himself through the Bible. And so we reform ourselves according to the Word of God. So this week, as you're reading the Bible, the question isn't, is this just good history? Is this entertaining? The question is, how can I change my life? How can we change our church? How can we change our society to be more in line with what God would have us be? So together, let's be reformed and always reforming. All right, that's all I got. Have a great week.